introduce us to the research with First Nations, Metis and Inuit peoples, and what we need to know about Indigenous patient engagement. Dr. Caroline Tait is a medical anthropologist with particular research interests in Indigenous health and social justice. She's a member of the Métis Nation, Saskatchewan, and she grew up in a small Métis community in central Saskatchewan. Dr. Tait is a member of the Faculty of Social Work and the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. So over to you, Dr. Tait.
Thank you, and I'll just share my screen here quickly. Is that okay for everyone at that end?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And I'm just actually going to do something else, and that's that I'm going to turn on my stopwatch here for 20 minutes so that I have it. So you'll hear it when it goes off. Hopefully we'll be in the question and answer by that time. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I'm Métis from a small town called McDowell, Saskatchewan, which is near Batoche, which is traditional territory for Métis people. And I just wanted to show you a little bit about, this is my family, my son up in the corner with his Tunisian grandmother. And in the middle, the person in the middle with the young boy with the white hair, and the man, that's my dad and my brother, which I think really, I love showing that picture because it shows kind of Métis families that we are always, we don't look exactly the same as First Nations in many ways, right? So people sometimes are looking for something that really, to understand Métis people, you know, you have to understand the diversity within us, and I would also, before I proceed, you know, really like to acknowledge a colleague of mine, Mary Bacage, who is, I think, here today, who's done an enormous amount of work in Indigenous peoples and patient research, patient involved research in that. And so I want to acknowledge her work and the work of CDTRP, who I work with very closely as well, and the work that we're doing. So some of the objectives today, you know, are really about asking that question, what is patient-oriented research within the context of Indigenous sovereignty for research and data governance? And what does that mean? And how does that apply to teams that have involvement of Indigenous patient and family partners? And how do ODT research teams address this issue? Because it is unique in the area that we work, and I'll move on, tell you more about that later in the presentation. So, as many of you know, historically, research has not been something that has necessarily been positive for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And some of that has been traditionally how research has played out, not just from university-based researchers, but from industry, from government. And there's been a withholding of research data of the products of research from Indigenous people. So you have metaphors such as the helicopter researcher, of somebody coming into a community, collecting a bunch of data and then leaving, and the community never hearing anything more about what happened to that data. And so Indigenous people generally they'll use the metaphor you'll often hear of, we've been researched to death, meaning that they feel that research has not benefited them, that research has not been ethical, that they have been left out, that they have been the objects of research, and that they're nothing more than being objectified in that context, right? And so a lack of ethical oversight has been traditionally the way that things have gone. However, in the 1990s, after the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, there was a group of First Nations women who wanted to make sure that their communities their people had access to Stats Canada data. And so they lobbied really hard. And out of that came what many of you have probably heard about are the First Nations principles of OCAP, which are First Nations ownership, control, access, and possession. And that was really the first time in a concerted way that Indigenous people, and in this case, it was driven by First Nations, that they lobbied and were successful in obtaining control over research data. And so now for many, many years, we've had the First Nations have had the First Nations Information and Data Governance Center, which runs the regional health survey for First Nations, which has been highly successful in capturing First Nations health and other data. And so that's really, it was out of that movement by this group of women, First Nations women, and the advancement of the OCAP principles through, at that time, the National Aboriginal Health Organization. And we saw CIHR, the tri-agencies also in the late 1990s also picked up on, this idea of needing, or it was really happened when the tri-agencies kind of changed. But this picking up on in the early 2000s, this need for ethical guidelines for research with Indigenous peoples. And at the center of that was the involvement of Indigenous people in research in a way that they had decision-making and decision-making, but also that idea of ownership, control, access, and possession of data, of research products, right? Activities and products. So this has been something that people like myself and others have been working on for decades. We're still pushing forward. So I just finished with Dr. Robert Henry, the Métis data governance principles in Saskatchewan for Métis Nation Saskatchewan. And so it's been really, really important. In the context, though, of OCAP, one of the things that I'll say is, and First Nations will agree, these are not First Nations principles. These are Western principles because they were in a context of trying to gain control in a Western context. So ownership, control, access, and possession are really Western tools for which First Nations can have control over their data. When you talk to First Nations people about research and about what they want from research, they say the same things in many ways that Métis people say. And I would imagine, I don't work so much with Inuit, but it's really about relationships. It's about trust, relationships, reciprocity, relevance. And so there is this whole national dialogue that has been going on for many, many years that has been driven by First Nations, and now with Inuit have their own data governance principles that exist, and so do Métis across the country. And embedded in that are sovereignty rights, and those sovereignty rights you find in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as you find them in treaty rights, and you find them in the inherent right of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, related to their cultural understandings and their cultural values that were there long before Europeans and European colonizers came to Canada. So what does a research project look like that involves Indigenous patient partners and families, as well as Indigenous health leadership? And do you need to have, if you have a group of, say, 5 or 6 First Nations, Métis, Inuit, so that can be all First Nations or all Inuit, all Métis, or it can be a mix. So if you have patient involvement and family involvement, do you need to have other Indigenous people involved, mainly Indigenous health leadership? And the answer is yes. So the rule of thumb is that if you have a project and you have Indigenous patients and families involved, but you do not collect data based upon Indigenous identity of having patients included, and that you're not looking at the research to understand what is unique to First Nations, Métis, Inuit patients that are involved. If they're just participating in your study, but Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit is not a variable, then in that regard, unless they were all Indigenous patients, in that regard, you don't need to have the involvement of Indigenous health leadership. But if it is, if you are looking at the unique journeys, the unique experiences of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit patients and families, then this will trigger you. And this is embedded within Indigenous data sovereignty and governance guidelines, as well as tri-agency guidelines. If you're applying for funding from any of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, for instance, or the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, this triggers your responsibility as a researcher, as a research team, a research lead, to engage with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit health leadership. And I'll go into why that is so. So looking at this is that in a context like this, the First Nations, Métis, Inuit health research partners, the community partners are your partners, and they play a certain role. The patients and families play a certain role, and the researchers play a certain role. And this can be a very, very important, fruitful partnership that can yield really important research outcomes. So how does this relate to patient-driven research? So what's important for health research teams, the lived experience of Indigenous patients and families is, I cannot tell you how important it is. It is so incredibly important because no one knows. Researchers don't know, and oftentimes our Indigenous leadership don't know because they're not living in the same context of which patients and families are. So for instance, in northern remote communities, if you're living with end-stage kidney disease, what does that look like, right? The best people to ask are the patients and the families, the people who know and who know what the solutions are. So when people say the solutions are in our Indigenous communities, they're really talking about that lived experience. So it's so important to have that lived experience and to situate that lived experience within colonial history. And the example that I'll refer you to, and I won't go into details, would be the case of David Dennis. So Mr. Dennis needed a liver transplant, was denied placement on the liver transplant list because he hadn't been abstinent for 6 months, right? There was a bit of a misunderstanding. He ended up being placed on the list, but he ended up passing away. But he filed a human rights complaint, and at the core of that, and you can go online and read more about this, is his point was that colonialism created the optimal conditions for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit to have higher rates of alcohol use disorder, leading to the need of a liver transplant. So even though more Indigenous people abstain from alcohol use than the general public of those who drink, there was higher risk. And he linked that back to colonialism. And so it's a very, very important, as an advocate, it was a very, very important message that he was giving to transplant programs across the country. And so why does that matter? And so that lived experience, his lived experience is informing policies around that 6-month rule, for instance. So informing policies and interventions that reflect the distinct needs. So we're distinctive. Do not use the term Indigenous. You cannot have Indigenous as a research category. It has to be First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and even whittling it down to Cree, Dene, Mohawk. There's a lot of important distinctions culturally, geographically, and historically that matter when you're collecting data. And ongoing critical analysis of health systems, including studying systemic racism. And systemic racism, I won't go into that, but it is something that is important. And the lived experience of Indigenous people is absolutely essential to understand that. But at the same time, we still need population level, for instance, health utilization data, because lived experience partners with health utilization data. And for a researcher looking at that means that we can then see if there's patterns that exist that indicate that maybe there is bias and racism and marginalization of Indigenous people. So what do you do with as a research team? These are easy principles. You engage First Nations, Métis, Inuit leadership at the very beginning of your project, and it depends on the scope and focus of your project, who you would approach. And there's many people like myself and others out there who you can ask to say who would be appropriate, but your patients who you're engaged with will know as well, right? So they're really, really important advisors to you in this. And so First Nations, Métis, Inuit leaders, they want to be able to have direct input influence over how data is collected, analyzed, and knowledge translation. So as a researcher, you know, oftentimes people talk about objectivity, that, you know, the data speaks for itself, right? That's true and not true. You can have 5 researchers with the same data, and the narrative that they tell of that data can be quite different. So, so the importance of having Indigenous people there is exactly that, where you may have data, for instance, that looks at diabetes and looks at behavior and say, well, you know, people are at higher risk for diabetes because they're not eating proper foods, they're not watching their diet, they're not exercising. You know, the community people with lived experience and the Indigenous leadership may come in and say, wait just a minute, we have problems with food security. We have problems with people not having access to proper food. We don't have an environment in which, you know, there's opportunities to exercise because it's changed traditionally over the years. So there's a lot of really important information that comes from the Indigenous leadership, who, remember, are always at the policy tables, always there fighting for our people in order to address those systemic issues, right? So the patient experience is incredibly important, but so is the experience of our Indigenous leadership. Right. And so they're the people who will be sitting at those tables. So this is my final slide. And so I work in this area and I laugh because I'm constantly getting a hold of, say, the Assembly of First Nations and saying, here's what I'm doing, here's what's happening. And they're like, that's great. We're so busy. We don't have time to actually do much around this issue, Caroline. Keep doing what you're doing. So I want to come back and say, listen, our Indigenous health leaders are overburdened and overworked with the amount of challenges that they have looking at other issues. So when I say that ODT is a secondary health issue, what I mean by that is the attention of our Indigenous leaders tends to be on issues such as youth suicide, addictions, mental health, diabetes, which relates to ODT, but prevention of diabetes, food security, housing security. So there's all of these big issues. So organ donation and transplantation is important to our Indigenous leadership, but it tends to fall into what I call a secondary health issue, that where the majority of their focus is on these other bigger issues, while maybe related to ODT, but focusing on ODT, it's hard when you don't have within an organization enough people to be able to address the issue and to have people sitting at the table. So this has been a challenge with Indigenous leadership, you know, and so that will be a challenge for a research team. And so what I would suggest is that, you know, because ODT does not receive the same amount of attention as a health issue, that it can be sometimes difficult for research teams to have involvement. So what I suggest is, in designing a patient-oriented research project, involve appropriate Indigenous health leaders as soon as you can in the project design. And that means sending them information. If they're not able to be there, they very much are still interested in what you're doing, and you really must inform them. And if they say they can't participate, or if you don't hear from them, try other avenues to engage them, right? But at the very least, do what I do, keep them informed, keep sending them information, and they'll appreciate that information very, very much, right? And that's where, and they really have an enormous amount of respect, our Indigenous leaders, for our patients, for Indigenous patient and family partners. So the Indigenous patients and family partners play a key role in that connection to Indigenous leadership, right? So that means that Indigenous patients and families must be compensated in ways in a research project that reflect that they're not only there as a patient family partner, but also that they will very much play that important liaison role between the researchers and the community partners. Keep updating people and share your research outcomes. Try to get that meeting when you have something really important that you want to share, something that will change policy, that will change the way that interventions are. That's when you really need to be very firm with the Indigenous leadership and say, we need your attention now. This is what we need your attention now. We want to move this forward. And I do that all the time. And, you know, they're very appreciative. Particularly in this area, they're very appreciative because they know that it's an area that they can't give the same amount of attention to. So that's my 20 minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tait. Yeah, I didn't hear your timer go ding, so I think you're within your 20 minutes. Such an important subject, though. It's a really, really important subject, and it's something that we need to have in front of all of those researchers as well. So, so I'm going to open up the floor to questions. So please feel free to ask questions to Dr. Tait using the chat box. You know, raising your hand. The virtual hand, or you can send a question anonymously directly to the CDTRP Q&A user in the participants list. So any questions for Dr. Tait? Yes, Sunny.
Caroline, again, as usual, perfect. A perfect overview for us who are going through the journey. Give us some hope. Are we getting there? You know, are we going the right direction? Are we making progress? You know, so that, you know, we're on the right track, we keep going, or are we still like totally missing the boat? We're still so far, you know, on the shore, we're not rowing yet.
Oh, so I'm very hopeful, very, very hopeful. So just recently, I'm in the process of forming a partnership with CDTRP, and I had a conversation with JAG, with the Canadian Society for Transplant. And part of my research is funded by the Saskatchewan Patient-Oriented Research, you know, and of course the work of Mary Bocage, and now Chief Phillips from the BC Chiefs is engaged. And we just received a Cafe Scientific grant yesterday to hold the first national online forum for Indigenous peoples. Mary will be involved in that. And so I think moving forward, it's very funny because trying to get more Indigenous people engaged has been challenging. I expected that by now, you know, there would be a number of researchers, for instance, across the country. So in that way, I feel like I need to step it up more to try to make this more attractive. One of the ways, though, that something we need to do collectively, and I'll put this out to the Indigenous patients and families as well as to others, is we need to get on the conference agendas of Indigenous peoples' conferences. We're not. So within the ODT world, you know, consistently now there's Indigenous people that are presenting, and it often is Mary and I that are presenting, but you know, we're getting there to have more people. But where we really need to focus on is getting onto the conference programs of the Assembly of First Nation. So that's something that has not happened. And we need to do that. And that, again, falls at the feet of myself and probably Mary and others who have those connections. So I think but I think as far as ODT, I think we have in this community a really strong opportunity to show the way of how we take a health issue that's that's not a priority for the Indigenous leadership, even though it is. They don't have enough bandwidth to make it a big focus. And so I think, with Chief Phillips and working with Mary, is how do we make it into an issue that they think about commonly and often, right? Because we do need the Indigenous leadership paying more attention than they're paying. And again, that I think, I think we're making headway that way. So yeah, so I'm very positive about moving forward.
Thank you. That's very encouraging. Super.
Thank you for the question, Sunny. Any other questions at the moment? Maybe, we have a hand up. Sandra.
Hey, Sandra.
Hey, Caroline. Hi, I have a question. So here where I live in Ontario, we actually have a Chief Franks as well. But what I find out, like getting involved in research, I think it's also good to have a background in how our health systems work in each province. So you're from the Saskatchewan SPOR, which is amazing. They're a leader as far as I'm concerned for that. But like here in Ontario, our government has this way of like bringing out funding opportunities and deliverables in a very fast pace. And even though they're saying, oh, we want the patient's voices and everything, they're not providing it in a way that we can do proper co-design. And that's with like any patient partner. So when I talk to my Indigenous friends, they're like, well, we're meeting the deliverables, but like, as you said, like, we talk about Indigenous, but as you say, like there's 7 or 8 different groups that are representative. And they say like, we'll meet our deliverable, but we're not all in agreement because we haven't had the time that it takes to do those engagements. And I really learned from going to the CanSolve conference in Halifax that Indigenous people work at a much slowed down pace, which I think is good. Like we're always so rushed to like, I don't know, it feels like the hanging carrot to get funding, right? To rush through and say like, well, we'll just get the patient on board now, but then we'll do the co-design afterwards. It doesn't work, right? So somehow we have to solve that problem. And it's, it's for patients as well, but it also for Indigenous people. I think it's from what I've heard from the friends like that yeah, way too fast, not building the relationships. I think one of the expression, it takes like, 10 cups of teas to build, just to start on a relationship, right? And then also once they get the healthcare experience and understand that, then they can see where the gaps are and where the lack of access is. And then they can see the priorities in the research. So we do have a ways to go, but I really appreciate people like yourself and Mary that are, opening up doors and, making it available to do. So thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, this is so important about relationship building. How do you build a relationship with, like, Hatchet Lake is a fly-in community here, right? So how do you build a relationship without resources? So oftentimes researchers are stuck without upfront resources to build those relationships where there is commonly the most need for a lens to look at the lived experience of patients and families that live there, right? And I think, I think we've been working in the area of research to try to have, ways in which development grants don't require so much of a partnership, so that we can get development grants in order to build those relationships, right? And I keep telling people, no matter what we're doing, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And our funding and the ways in which everything is, it's a sprint, right? Because you have these short timelines. And so we've been working really hard at helping funders to understand that this is a marathon of building research programs and research pathways that support the voices. And then when you go back to those principles, like there's the principles of OCAP, but when you go back to those principles around respect, reciprocity, all of those things, then you get into that relationship building piece, right? And that, so thanks for your question. It's a really important question.
Thanks, Sandra. We got just a couple of minutes left, but Mary, can you fill our last few minutes?
Oh, of course, I always can. And thank you for mentioning me. That was really, really sweet. I do want to sort of comment on what Sandra was saying too, and acknowledging that there is a different time frame in terms of how we look at things, and that really lends to talking about two-eyed seeing and the ethical space that that we look at in terms of how we do things. And I'm reminded, I'll just give you this one quick story, and I'm just reminded of the teaching that an elder taught me in terms of the language. When you hear the Anishinaabe language, for example, it's very fluid, it's almost sing-songy in the way it's really traditionally spoken. And I was taught that when you hear an English speaker, a lot of times they're speaking fast to get their points in, to get their point across. But as Anishinaabe, and I can only speak from my own background as being an Anishinaabe woman, is that we talk slower so that the person that we're speaking to understands what we say instead of getting the point across. So that also lends to the time that it takes to build relationships and to make sure that the person that you're speaking to understands what you're saying, because we are an oral based history. So that's where a lot of that comes in as well. So I just wanted to share those points just to sort of expand on what Sandra was talking about in terms of the time it takes to really build relationships. And I always say too that 75% of your work in working with Indigenous communities will be building those relationships and taking that time, and 25% or less will actually be doing the work that you plan on doing. And we have to remember things like nothing about me without me. That's where the co-design, and that's where the making sure that you're coming from an aspect of wellness as opposed to an aspect of deficit building. So those are just things I just wanted to share and just add to what Caroline presented. So thank you, Caroline.
Thanks. And I thank you so much. The last thing just to add is that as you're partnering with patients, Indigenous patients, as you're partnering with Indigenous researchers, one of the things you should never use us as brokers for your research, right? We have our own research programs, we have our own relationships, and full partnerships of Indigenous researchers, even if they're young junior researchers, that's really, really important. And so our job is not to broker relationships. If you're a researcher who wants to work with First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples, you need to go there, you need to visit, you need to build trust, and you should never put an Indigenous person who's a researcher, particularly a young person, in a position where you're asking them to do that on your behalf. If you want to do it, then you have to do it yourself and make the commitment. And as Mary said, it takes a while, but anyways, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Great presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Tait. And then thank you to everybody, to Sunny and Sandra and Mary for their thoughtful questions.